Now, this morning we are going to be digging a bit into communist propaganda techniques. Now, we've already related to our previous audiences here at this school how I myself first became involved in the communist criminal conspiracy by joining a communist front, Cambridge Youth Council in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I related that I was greatly puzzled by the success that the communists were having in victimizing innocent individuals. Obviously successful. Now, if you have any doubt about the record, I would suggest that you might write to Washington, D.C., to your own congressman, and ask your own congressman to send you the guide, G-U-I-D-E, the Guide to Subversive Organizations and Publications, because it is an education in itself. You will find 140 pages. You will find 8, 9, 10 organizations listed on every single page. It is simply staggering to discover the success the communists have had, because the story of every communist front is the story of innocent individuals victimized. Remember that there's a big difference between a communist organization and a communist front organization. A communist organization is composed of communists. Communist front organization is composed of non-communists. 95% of the young people who joined the Cambridge Youth Council listed in the Guide to Subversive Organizations, 95% were non-communists, had not the faintest idea that the organization was dominated, controlled by the communist criminal conspiracy. Same is true of American Youth for Democracy. 95% of the young people who joined AYD did not know that all of their top officers, Don Bolin, their state president, Bernice Rogers, their state secretary, Herb Philbrick, their state treasurer, all of us were secret communists, all of us taking our orders and instructions from Communist Party headquarters, District 1, Boston, Massachusetts. And so the Guide to Subversive Organizations is a dubious tribute to the skill of the communists and to the success that the communists have had in victimizing non-communist Americans. It is an amazing, amazing picture. And I must say that as I observed this from inside the communist ranks, I was not only amazed, I was not only shocked, but I want to assure you I could not understand how in the world the communists were able to do it. How could they do it? Well, it took me quite a while before I began to catch on. Now, as you start into the communist movement, the communists don't reveal all of their secrets to you right off. You can sure bet that. When I first joined the Young Communist League, the communists did not open up their training program with a Communist Party manual and organization, which states specifically that it is the policy and purpose of the Communist Party to work towards the destruction of our government by force, by violence, by bloodshed. No, indeed. Communists knew that at that time with these young communists, if they hit them with that kind of a message in the beginning, they would probably run, not walk to the nearest door, and they'd be gone. No, indeed, turning a person into a communist is a fairly long and involved process. Doesn't happen overnight. It is not an easy task, and the communists work at it diligently. Finally, however, after you have moved deeply enough into the communist ranks, then you find that they indeed do teach some very specific things. For example, in the Communist Party manual on organization, we find on page 8 a chapter having to do with the role and aim of the Communist Party. What do they say? Quote, as the leader and organizer of the proletariat, the Communist Party of the USA leads the working class in the fight for the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism, for the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat, communist form of government, for the establishment of a socialist Soviet republic in the United States. The strange thing is, however, that despite the fact that this is what communism stands for, many non-communists cooperated with the Communist Party, actually helped the Communist Party, gave their names to the Communist Party, contributed money to the Communist Party. How did it happen? Well, I found out that there were several tricks to the trade, and I began to learn this when the communists, noting that I was employed in the advertising profession, decided to put me to work in what they called the Agit-Prop Division, AGIT-PROP P-R-O-P, agitation and propaganda. And it was there I worked for most of my 9 years in the Communist Party. At first, I began as simply designing leaflets and brochures, making the design and layout for this material. Later on, the Communists gave me the responsibility of actually preparing some of the copy for the propaganda messages. I know I was given one job of working on a manual that was used for the actual training of communists, so that I was involved in teaching other communists Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism, which was a pretty good job for a counter-spy for the FBI, I must say. Now, after I started to work at Communist Party headquarters, I observed, first of all, the fact that after these communists prepared their messages, and then they were ready for distribution by printing or mimeographing or other form, the communists were very careful to always remove the Communist Party label. They'd remove that label, and they'd apply a new label, let us say American Youth for Democracy, at the present time the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. False labeling was one of the keys to their technique of victimizing people, but even this didn't explain the reason for the amazing amount of response and success that was obtained. But I began to notice on the bookshelves, and I noticed in the hands of the communist propagandists, books by a lad by the name of Pavlov. And the light began to dawn. The light began to dawn. And I found indeed that these communist propagandists were great students of the Soviet scientist, or Russian scientist, I should say, Pavlov. Now, Pavlov, a non-communist, was a legitimate Russian scientist. No question about his integrity or his learning or his brilliance. Indeed, it was through Pavlov that we now have a great deal of information that perhaps we would not have, or at least would have taken a lot longer to discover. Pavlov, you'll recall, was the lad who observed that if you placed a plate of food before a dog, saliva would begin to run in the dog's mouth. And Pavlov noticed that this seemed to be an automatic response. In other words, the dog didn't seem to think about it. He didn't seem to consciously order the saliva to run. It seemed to happen automatically without the dog's thinking about it. And so Pavlov wondered, well, could it be that there is a special section of the brain that automatically triggers these responses? And if this is so, what kind of responses are these? Well, it turned out that Pavlov was indeed right. He was correct in his guess. And indeed, there is a special section of the brain which does exactly that. And you'll remember Pavlov's famous experiments, for example, his experiment with a dog, wherein he would place a plate of food before the dog, but every time he did that, he would ring a bell. Ring a bell. And he kept repeating this over and over again. Plate of food, ring the bell. Plate of food, ring the bell, until finally, he could place an empty dish before the dog. No food in it. Ring the bell. The saliva began to run in the dog's mouth. Now, the animal's thinking processes had been scientifically short-circuited. The animal had been conditioned to respond to a false impulse. And the communists noticed this. And they said, this is a very clever little trick. And if this clever gimmick can work on one form of animal life, it can work just as well on other forms of animal lives. And we communists know that man is an animal. Man is an animal. There's no difference between the dog and any other form of animal life. And if these scientific facts can apply to one form, it can apply to another form. And so this is the basis, this is the foundation, this is the root of communist propaganda techniques. In fact, the communists talked a great deal in our cell meetings about sometimes Pavlovian psychiatry, but now they claim this to be Soviet psychiatry. This is a Russian invention, you see. Well, now, the reason why the communists feel these things can and do apply to humans has been brilliantly pointed out in Dr. Fred Schwarz's testimony concerning the communist mind. I know that many of you are familiar with his testimony. If you aren't, you should not only study, but believe me, you should memorize this testimony. It is one of the most brilliant pieces of testimony given before Congress in a compact form, giving, I think, in a fewer words, the greatest understanding concerning the way a communist mind operates. Now, Fred Schwarz has pointed out that communism has given its philosophy certain scientific laws. And he points out that these laws are as follows. The first one is, there is no God. They are proudly, unashamedly atheistic in theory and in practice. When they deny God, they simultaneously deny every virtue and every value that originates with God. They deny moral law. They deny absolute standards of truth and righteousness. An entire civilized code of moral and ethical values is destroyed. The second law of communism is that man is a material machine. He is matter in motion and nothing more. Man is a body, and he is completely describable in terms of the laws of chemistry and physics. Man has no soul, no spirit, no significant individual value, no continuity of life. He is entirely an evolutionary product and subject to the modification, adaptation, and transformation by the applied established laws of animal husbandry. Now, this is indeed what a communist believes. Man is a machine, a machine. Now, the communists know that we Americans are conditioned to respond to certain word impulses, not just the ringing of a bell, but certain words. There are certain words, for example, whether we hear them or whether we read them, to which we have been conditioned to respond from our earliest childhood in a favorable way. There are other words to which we are conditioned to respond in an unfavorable way. Let us see how this actually works in practice. I know that yesterday I said I was going to be telling you about brainwashing in the United States. And I know some people must have said, well, Philbrick, now you're going way out on a limb. This can't be. We know, of course, been brainwashing in slave labor camps in the Soviet Union or in Red China, but it can't be that people have been brainwashed in free America. Well, let me give you one example. Let's take a look again at this Guide to Subversive Organizations and Publications. And incidentally, if your congressman should write back and say that is out of print, and it does happen to go out of print from time to time, you write another letter back to him right away and say, sir, get that book back in print and hurry up. Or we'll see that you get back out of Washington, D.C. Now, when you get this little booklet, open it up just to page 1. You don't have to go any further than that. Page 1. What do you find? You find there a little paragraph describing a very successful Communist Party school. Now, this Communist Party school was organized by the Communist Party. It was operated by the Communist Party. It was controlled by the Communist Party. And this particular school, which operated with great success in Chicago, Illinois for a period of time, was also helpful to the communists in raising money. They raised thousands of dollars through this school. Now, what did the communists do? What did their Pavlovian or Soviet psychiatry tell them? Did they go up to a man's door in Chicago? And did they knock at a door and say, sir, will you contribute to the Communist Party school? Well, they sure didn't, because their Soviet psychiatry told them, well, this was a word, symbol, to which most Americans or most people in Chicago area are conditioned to respond to in an unfavorable way. So unfavorable, they might get socked in the eye or kicked down the stairs. And so what did they do? They went up to the same man's door and knocked at his door and said, sir, will you contribute to the Abraham Lincoln School? Fellow says, sure, I believe in Abraham Lincoln. Here's my $10, $100, or whatever it might have been. His thinking process is short-circuited just long enough, and that's all it took. Now, this same trick has been worked over and over again, and you know, it's like these magicians' tricks. One of the reasons why magicians get away with it is because they're so simple. And you're looking for something awfully complicated. Well, here's one of the simplest gimmicks or tricks in the world. And it has worked over and over again. They're still working it today. Now, go through the rest of that booklet. For example, the communists accuse us of being super Americans. We're super patriots. We are chauvinists and all that sort of thing. Go through the Guide to Subversive Organizations, their own list of names. And what is the word they use more than any other word to apply to their own subversive organizations? American. American. Over and over again. Why? Because they believe in America? Of course not. That's ridiculous. This is a word symbol, simply a grouping of letters to which we here in this country have been conditioned to respond to in a favorable way. You'll find words like peace and freedom and democracy. What do they call their slave nations in the Soviet Union? People's democracies. These are cybernetic symbols or Pavlovian symbols designed to get a favorable response. How about the word peaceful coexistence? It's not an American term. It's a Russian term. First used by Lenin way back many years ago, then used by Stalin, and now being used by Khrushchev. These are word symbols designed to lull us to sleep. These are tranquilizing pills in the hope that we, Americans, will be lulled to sleep so that we will do nothing. So long as we do nothing, they can continue to win. Now remember, brainwashing is the trick of deceiving a person without the person's knowing it's happened to him. Incidentally, the use of the names of individuals. Why are they used? Why are they used? Why do they have Herb Philbrick's name at the top of the letterhead of the Cambridge Youth Council? Because Philbrick was known in the Boston area as a Christian youth leader. He was known as a young advertising executive, member of the Advertising Club of Boston and Advertising Federation of America and so forth. Here was a symbol, you see, designed to mislead or confuse anyone who might have any doubts concerning that organization. What about the list of names we mentioned yesterday? You find on the letterheads of all the Communist Front organizations the names of prominent individuals. Why? These are Soviet psychiatric terms designed to mislead or confuse. One of the great tragedies is that the communists always seek to use not only their old fellow traveling names, but in every new front, they put a great deal of effort into obtaining the names of individuals who are not communists, who have no connection with communists, who cannot be accused of communists, but whose names are very helpful and very valuable to the communist criminal conspiracy. Let me give you just one example, another example of how this was done. We told you yesterday of how the communists also gave us, our Young Communist League, the task of raising money for the party, and how one of the most successful money-raising organizations was the National Council for American-Soviet Friendship. See the words used? Friendship. What American doesn't believe in the word friendship, you see? And we related how a great many good Americans contributed to that organization. Thousands of dollars to that one group. Now, in addition to the name of the organization, which the communists used, we young communists also were armed with a letterhead of the organization. A letterhead beautifully printed on fine stationery, list of names down the left-hand side of the page, prominent names in the community, but right at the top of the letterhead in big, bold, black letters, very prominent. On this letter authorizing us to collect money for this organization, they had the name of the Massachusetts State Chairman of the Council for American-Soviet Friendship. What was that name? Bishop G. Bromley Oxnam of the Methodist Church. Now, why was that name there? Was it there because Reverend Oxnam is a communist? Of course not. It's much better for the communists to use the name of an individual who's not a communist. Now, why the value of that particular slogan? This meant nothing to the communists, only that this was a word symbol which were designed to short-circuit people's thinking process just long enough until they dropped their dimes and nickels and dollars into the plate. Why? Because here is a word symbol which would mislead people into thinking this was a legitimate organization. Here's a word symbol to which people's minds are conditioned with the idea of giving or contributing, you see. What better symbol could they possibly use? Well, you will find, as I say, a fantastic number of examples of this Soviet psychiatry or cybernetic warfare in action. Now, we've been using the word cybernetics. The word cybernetics, incidentally, has a legitimate meaning. The science of cybernetics is a legitimate science. Our own scientists, in fact, if there are those here today, and I know there may be, people here in the electronics field, or perhaps in the field of electronic calculators, or in radio or television, they will be familiar with the term cybernetics. And they will know that the science of cybernetics has to do with the improvement of the flow of communications. The improvement in the flow of communications or information. The science of cybernetics has made possible the development of these huge electronic magnificent calculators. Science of cybernetics has made possible the improvement of flow of communications or information on a telephone line. It used to be that only one message could be conveyed in one direction at one time on a telephone wire. Now, through the science of cybernetics, they can pour hundreds of messages at one time, simultaneously, on a wire running in both directions. They've improved the flow of communications tremendously. Telephone companies use the science of cybernetics to a fantastic degree to improve the flow of communications or information. What in the world has this got to do with communism? Well, nothing except that, again, remember the communist picture of a man. A man is a machine. A man is a machine. He is matter in motion and nothing more. The nerves in our bodies compared to coaxial cables or telephone lines are simply means of conveying information or communications. The brain cells in our brains compared to the transistors or the electronic tubes in an ordinary electronic brain. No difference. No difference, basically, scientifically, to a communist. Now, what about the electronic brain? An electronic brain is a machine which has been conditioned, preconditioned to respond to certain impulses. It has been conditioned, for example, so that if you punch a hole in a card in a certain position, built into that machine is a response, or what they call a feedback. So that when you feed that card in, automatically the machine bounces back, let us say, with a number 3, a conditioned response. So an electronic brain to a communist is just another continuation of the same science, you see. Now, if we communists can control electronic brains, we can control the human brain as well. Why? Because their definition of the science of cybernetics, their definition is the manipulation and control of information. The manipulation and control of information. What does this mean? Well, this gives us the reason why the Iron Curtain exists. The Iron Curtain exists not only in terms of the barbed wire entanglements, not only in terms of the machine guns and the police dogs and the strip of plowed land. The Iron Curtain also exists in terms of jamming stations. There are 900 jamming stations all up and down that Iron Curtain. Why? To try to prevent the flow of information or communication from the free world into the enslaved people. To cut off that information. I worked on the staff of the New York Herald Tribune for 8 years. Russian people are forbidden to read the New York Herald Tribune. Exactly 6 copies of that paper goes into that country every day, and they go to the Kremlin, and that's all. 6 copies. And other than that, nobody in the Soviet Union is permitted to read that paper. Why? Because in order to control the people, you have to control information or communications. And then you control all of the avenues of the radio, of the newspaper, of books, of magazines. All communication is controlled, and then, scientifically, you pour into the avenues of communication only that information which will cause the people to respond or to go in certain directions. And you withhold all information which will cause the people to respond or go in a direction you might not want to have them go in, you see. Thereby, we communists can control people as human robots just by pushing the right buttons at the right time, and they will respond. Well, now, thank God we can report that this scientific trick has not been completely successful. As a matter of fact, it has broken down many, many times. But at least this is the theory, and it is a dangerous theory, and it is an extremely dangerous practice. Why? Because it has been used not only behind the Iron Curtain, but our own country as well. As we've gone through the investigations of communists in our land, you will find a large number of names turning up from Hollywood. Why? Are they out there for their health or for the nice climate you have here? No, indeed. Communists are in Hollywood because they've been ordered to go to Hollywood. And where do you find the communists? Who are these people? They're the script writers. Script writers. They're not the set designers. They're not the stage people. Very seldom do you find a cameraman. I can't recall of a cameraman being they're script writers. They're the people who have control of the information or the communications channels, you see. We find Albert Maltz, for example, identified many times in the investigations concerning communism. last year, our good friend Frank Sinatra was going to make another picture. Before we talk about that picture, go back and take a look at the history, a little bit of the history of World War I. We find that in World War I, many hundreds of thousands of American boys gave their lives. They gave their lives bravely, as men of valor, as men of honor, gave their lives in order to preserve the freedom that we have in this land. Out of all the men who died thusly, one man, and one man only, was executed for cowardly desertion. His name, Private Philbrick. And so what did Frank Sinatra intend to produce? A picture by the name of, you guessed it, the execution of Private Philbrick. Now, out of all the stories that they could have told, why that one story? At this time, when our men in uniform need to be proud of that uniform, when we, the American people, need to be proud of our boys wearing that uniform, why tell the story of an individual who make us ashamed of that uniform or ashamed of the men who wear it? An accident? And was it an accident that when they selected a scriptwriter for that, they selected Albert Maltz, who has been writing for the communists for years? Of course it wasn't an accident. Why? Because the motion picture screen is, to the communists, part of cybernetic warfare, a means of communication. And what better way? People go to the movies for entertainment. They don't go to the movies expecting a message. But the message has been there. I know that many of you, perhaps who have gone to the movies in the last 2 or 3 years, have noticed a large number of pictures having to do with men of the armed forces. And as you've observed these pictures, what do you find? Pictures about the Navy, the Army, the Marines, the Coast Guard. Oh, they're a lot of fun. They're usually in the form of comedies, so-called comedies. The officers, of course, are pictured as great big jokes to be laughed at. They're ridiculous people, not much sense, really, no brains. They're comics. Certainly not meant to be honored or obeyed or respected. Or if they're not pictured in that form, then they're very cruel and inhuman and unjust, and they needlessly risk the lives of their men and sacrifice their men for their own personal ambitions or whatnot. Pretty bad lot altogether, according to Hollywood. What about the men in uniform, the GIs? Oh, they're a pretty bad bunch, too. They're unkempt and slovenly, and or they're a criminal type who can't live in civilian life. The Army is the only escape for them, you see. My wife and I dropped in to a movie just a short time ago. After we got to the movie, we found that the name of the picture was The Enemy Below. The Enemy Below. What was this all about? Well, it was a picture of a sub-destroyer. And, it was a very interesting picture. It was in technicolor and very well done, well directed, well acted. But what about the story? Well, the officer on this ship, the sub-destroyer, was the most unhappy man you'd ever seen in your life. He was perfectly miserable in his job. He hated his work. The only thing he looked forward to was the day when he could get out of the service. As sub-destroyers, they were very unsuccessful for the whole picture, running some 45 minutes, which was supposed to have taken several days of action. Sub got away clean. I mean, they fired hundreds of these depth bombs without any luck at all. They were an awful bad bunch of men, really. The American crew, the American crew, the sailors on there were a pretty sloppy bunch. They were very disrespectful to the commanding officer. By comparison, the Germans in the sub below, under a dictatorship, they were full of snap and spit and polish and discipline. It was terrific. Under a dictatorship, you see, here was the contrast. Here was a crew they could be proud of. We Americans had to sit there and say, gee, our boys are not very good lot, are they? Here's the key, however. If you had stopped any person leaving the theater that night after the picture, and if you had asked them, how'd you like the picture tonight? They say, great, wonderful. Boy, it was filled with action and technicolor and shot and show. And, it was a very exciting and interesting picture. But if you had asked any parent leaving the theater that night, tell me, would you want your son to be in the Navy? They'd say that's the last place in the world they'd want on the page. Or if you'd ask any young man leaving the theater that night, tell me, would you want to join the Navy? He'd look up at you and say, hey, do you think I'm nuts? You see? Cybernetic Warfare, the manipulation and control of information based upon Soviet psychiatry to plant ideas favorable to the Soviet Union and disastrous to the defense of the United States. This has happened over and over and over again. There's one picture that really should have been seen, if you haven't seen it, for a beautiful example of the communist message on the motion picture screen. People should have seen the motion picture on the beach. Beautiful example of cybernetic warfare. Beautiful example. Now, these things cannot happen by accident. Now, as you know, I worked on the staff of the New York Herald Tribune for 8 years. We in the newspaper field and newspaper people here today know that we have had a fantastic battle for control of our press. It's a battle still going on, a fierce fight. We know that the communists moved into the newspaper guild. We know that in New York City, for example, the communists controlled the newspaper guild, grabbed control of it. And it was a tremendous battle before, it took 3 years before we were finally able to kick the communists out of control. A newspaper man knows that we have had problems and still have problems. This is no secret. Why? Why? Because newspapers are communists or publishers are communists? Of course not. Why in the world do you find communists in the publishing field? Because they've been sent there. Because this is a means of communication, of controlling information. What does a communist have to do in a newspaper? Does he necessarily have to write pro-communist stories? No, indeed. If he's sitting on a particular desk in a paper, let's say a cable desk, he knows that coming into that cable desk every day in our leading newspapers are at least 10 times more news than that paper can carry. At least 10 times more than the paper can carry. So what does he have to do? All he has to do is use the wastebasket. Any story coming in on the foreign cables that are unfavorable to the Soviet Union, into the wastebasket. Any stories coming in from the foreign cables which are favorable to the Soviet Union, onto the city desk. All you have to do is pull the right plugs, you see, and push the right buttons, and you can manipulate and control information. Read the book Red Star over Cuba. Beautiful example of cybernetic warfare in action. The American people were misled concerning Cuba because we received the wrong information concerning Castro and his communist backers in Cuba. Wrong information. Herbert Matthews, one of the prime reasons for that misinformation, is still on the staff of the New York Times today. Why? I cannot understand. I do not know. That is something the New York Times will have to reply to. What about radio and television? We have in New York City at the present time a very fine group of radio and television individuals. But let me tell you that there is a desperate fight for control, a desperate battle for control going on in New York City right at the radio and television headquarters right now. The anti-communist group is called AWARE, A-W-A-R-E. And right now my friends in AWARE tell me that they don't know how the issue is going to be resolved. Right now, it's about a 50-50 chance that the anti-communists will be able to win and hang on to what there is there of our radio and television communications circuit. When you see the film strip, Communism on the Map, what do you find? You'll find that there are a very small number of unions in this country today still controlled by the communists. What's one of the top unions? Communications Workers Union. Communications Workers Union. Kicked out of the CIO because of its communist control. Why? Manipulation and control of information. Hundreds of examples could be given over and over again. Now, as we said before, a great deal of this may be simply not that you change a story or angle a story, but simply that you leave certain information out. You don't have to go any further than your own Los Angeles Times to find examples of this. Now, why? I know there has been much controversy stimulated recently because of the Times material on the John Birch clubs. I'm not going to take one side or the other at this time, but only I will make a prediction, and that is that the editorial, which will be published this coming Sunday, and if there is a Times man here, he can bring it back to headquarters and tip them off that this is what I said. I predict now that that editorial concerning the John Birch Society will be against the John Birch Society. Now, why? because on the basis of previous history of that particular newspaper. When at any time have they ever promoted or boosted or sponsored any anti-communist organization? I can't remember of any time. Have they ever boosted, for example, the Cardinal Mindszenty Foundation, which is doing a great job? They have hundreds of chapters across the country that time. Have they ever had a good word to say about the Cardinal Mindszenty group? I don't think so. Cybernetic warfare, you see. In other words, if you can cut off from the people any information about these things, what better results? You don't have to say anything pro-communist in the paper. Let me give you another example. 2 weeks ago, in Washington, a bill was brought before the Senate. This bill is the Freedom Academy bill, Senate Bill 822. This bill calls for the establishment of a Freedom Academy or a Freedom Institute by our government. It's one of the great steps forward. This has been in the mill now for 2 years. It was brought before the Senate last year and debated for 3 days on the floor of the Senate. They conducted hearings for 2 weeks. 2 weeks, hearings were conducted. They had top people testify before that committee and in these hearings. People like David Sarnoff, Daniel James, who is a leading authority in the subject of communism, a student, General C.B. Capel, Deputy Director of Central Intelligence. Now, this bill would set up a Freedom Academy or a Freedom Institute. A Freedom Institute would be on the same academic and intellectual level as West Point or Annapolis, except that instead of training people in the art of military warfare, instead of training them in the art of naval warfare, it would train them in the art of political warfare, cold warfare, economic warfare, propaganda warfare, training which our government does not provide at the present time. Our State Department people are sent out without any training. Without any training. And so as Senator Tom Dodd pointed out, as I read yesterday, this is a case, for example, as in Cuba, a case of disorganized amateurs being sent out up against organized professionals. Now, Senator Dodd, in his speech concerning this bill, had this to say: I would like to observe at the outset that this is a bill of extraordinary importance to the United States and the free world. In fact, the Judiciary Committee, in reporting the bill favorably, has described it as one of the most important ever introduced in Congress. I fully agree with this estimate. If anything, I consider it an understatement. I believe that the preservation of our freedom, the preservation of the free world as we know it, may ultimately depend on the enactment of this measure. Now, Senator Tom Dodd, Democrat of Connecticut, I think knows what he's talking about. Not one single line appeared in the Los Angeles Times concerning this debate, this bill, Senator Dodd's speech. The people here have not even heard that the bill exists. Cybernetic warfare, the cutting off of information which might possibly damage the communist criminal conspiracy. Now, if someone can explain how these things happen, I'd be glad to hear the explanation. I cannot tell you how they happen. I can't tell you why they happen. All we can point out is this is a fact. This is a fact. Not a line appeared in the paper. I know that one young lady was talking to her just before we came in this morning concerning the Communications Union. And the fact that right now, the Communications Workers Union, a union dominated, controlled by the communist criminal conspiracy, controls all of the tie lines and the cables coming out of the Pentagon. And the question of this young lady was, well, how can this be? I wish I knew. I wish I knew. This is some kind of a strange insanity. All we can say is that most of it is because of apathy, indifference, and complacency. Our only encouragement is to thank God the American people are beginning to wake up. And pretty soon, the complaint is made, many times that we should recognize Red China so that we could know more about what's going on in Red China. You don't have to recognize Red China to find out what's going on there. Besides, we would very much like to know what's going on there, and for that reason, our government our government has authorized 25 top newspaper writers and reporters in this country, given them permission, given them visas to go into Red China. Red China has refused to let them in. Refused to let them in. And again, in negotiations reported in today's papers, Red China has again turned down, has refused to let these reporters go behind the Iron Curtain. Now, this is very interesting, because I tore out some tear sheets from a magazine. The date of this was January 31, 1961. Here is a report from Red China. Report from Red China. How in the world did this report show up when the communists refused to let our reporters into the country? Well, I wish the magazine who printed this article had explained what the reason was, because we find that the author of the article is a man by the name of Edgar Snow. Who's Edgar Snow? Edgar Snow was a member of the IPR, the Institute of Pacific Relations, cited as an agent of Soviet foreign policy. He was a writer for the magazine, Amerasia magazine, a communist magazine. He was one of the leading propagandists whose job it was to mislead and confuse the American people concerning communist activities in Red China. This was one of the men who assured us there was nothing wrong with these nice Chinese over there. They were just agrarian reformers. Edgar Snow. His wife, this is not reported in this foreword. Neither is it revealed in the foreword of this article that his wife, Nim Wales, who runs under another name by the name of Nim Wales, is an identified member of the Communist Criminal Conspiracy, so identified by sworn witnesses testifying under oath. Now, you know, I have no objection, none at all, for our American people to read communist propaganda so long as it is identified as such. We need to know, and we need to read, and we need to study communist propaganda, but it should be so labeled, accurately, honestly, and truthfully. And Look magazine did not reveal that this man has been a Soviet propagandist for years and years and years, and there's only one reason he was allowed to go into Red China by the communists, because they knew that they could depend upon him to say exactly what they wanted him to say, and nothing else. Not the truth, but cybernetic warfare, the manipulation and control of information. Only that information, you see, that they want the American people to hear. Cut off any information that they don't want the American people to know. Cybernetic warfare in action right now, today. Well, we mustn't take much more of your time except to say that a key example of cybernetic warfare today have to do with slave labor in the Soviet Union. We are being told now, oh, there's no more slavery in the Soviet Union. The slave labor camps have been abolished. People have been released. Is that true? Here is a booklet called Stalin's Slave Camps. This was put out by the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions. All across this map, you will see tiny red dots. Looks like smallpox. Looks like smallpox. Each red dot signifies a slave labor or a concentration camp. Each dot. Today, there are 10 millions of Russian people in those slave labor and concentration camps. 10 million. There are more concentration camps behind the Iron Curtain today than there were at the death of Stalin. More. Now, where do we get this information? We get it from the witnesses who have testified, and this is, again, why the House Committee and the Senate Committee need to be maintained, need to continue their work, because this is our source of information. As we have listened to the testimony of individuals who have escaped from behind the Iron Curtain, how do we know their stories are true? Let me read to you this paragraph. Some of these witnesses are highly educated. Others are simple, uninstructed peasants. Some are Russians, others are foreigners. Some are political, others are not. Some are pro-communist, others are anti-communist. Some are men, some are women, and some are children. Some talk one language, others talk another. Yet each in his own words and in his own way brings the same story, beginning with a brutal arrest and separation of families, and recounts the same systematic police terror and tortures, the same mass transportation in cattle cars to distant places, leading to the same brutal system of mass slavery. Yes, these accounts give a single consistent picture. The Soviet Empire is covered from end to end by a system of slavery, brutality, torture, and terror. Tests have been made to prove the reliability of witnesses, persons who are unknown to each other, but who have been interned in the same camp at different times, have drawn identical plans of the camp layout and have given identical descriptions of the physical environs as well as of the slavery itself. Their stories tallied in every detail. It is impossible to doubt the reliability of these witnesses. Now, in this battle for cybernetic warfare, this means we must keep the channels of communication open. We must maintain the House Committee on Un-American Activities as a source of truthful information. We must keep the Senate Investigating Committee open as a source of information. Information which we need desperately. One of the hoaxes of communist propaganda is, of course, that the Russian people are communists. Even some history books today carry misinformation about the Soviet Union and the Russian people. Remember always that the Russian people are not communists. Remember that. This is very important. The Russian people are not communists. The Russian people are not our enemies. There's absolutely no quarrel between the Russian people and ourselves. None. Only 3% of the people of the Soviet Union are members of the communist criminal conspiracy. Only 3%. We, the Russian people and the American people, have a common enemy, and that enemy is the communist dictatorship. Why do we know this? Because of the very fact that there are 10 millions of Russian people in slave labor and concentration camps. Why? Because they're for communism? No, because they're against communism. Why did Stalin and Khrushchev, his first right-hand lieutenant, wipe out someplace between 12 and 15 millions of Russian people in a 3-year period, 1930 to 33? Because they were against communism. Why is it that some 20 millions of Chinese people have been ruthlessly exterminated in Red China? Because they're against communism. They're on our side. Right now, the people of the Congo are on our side. On our side. The Congolese people do not want communism. And yet, what do we find? We find the United Nations at this time firing on our friends, the Congolese people, and protecting the communists in the Congo. Now, whose side are we on, or whose side is the United Nations on? We'd better start asking some very sharp questions. Now, I've had a wonderful opportunity since leaving the communist movement, being pulled out by the FBI, thank God. I wouldn't want to be in there today, as I told you last night. And despite the smear attacks made upon so-called informers by a writer to one of your local newspapers, I said what I said last night, not because this school needs any defense. It doesn't, as Dr. Schwarz said. But I did speak last night, and I speak again now for those who must remain silent. Those who are informing for the FBI today inside the communist criminal conspiracy. People whose jobs are the toughest in the world. And I would like to know of that particular writer if he'd want to exchange places with them. I'm sure he wouldn't. I'm sure he wouldn't. So I stand today before you humbly, because I know that there are others who will not receive any of these wonderful opportunities I've had. And I stand before you humble because I've met some of the people from behind the Iron Curtain. I know that there's a chapter here in Los Angeles of the anti-communist Russian underground organization. And wonderful people they are. There may be some here today. Wonderful people they are. Russian people who today have a very fine underground organization operating in Russia itself. That despite everything the communists have been able to do, despite their cybernetic warfare, despite their brainwashing, despite their psychiatric tricks, despite the torture and the terror and the slave labor camps and the killings, there are still people, Russian people, behind the Iron Curtain today who do not believe in Khrushchev, who believe in God. There is an underground church behind the Iron Curtain. We have only one job to do, only one task. As Americans, if we really believe in freedom, if we really believe in freedom, we believe in freedom not only for ourselves, not only for our own people, but we must believe in the freedoms for all peoples in all parts of the world, and we must work constantly towards the day of the extinction of the communist enemy wherever it exists.